Chapter 1. The Photo in the Envelope. The sky in Paris was gray, and a drizzle fell like thin threads, clinging to the frosted glass of Maigret's office window. The chill of the afternoon seeped through the half-closed door, carrying with it the familiar musty smell of the old town. There was a knock on the door, soft but urgent, as if the person knocking wanted to enter but was afraid of being heard. Maigret looked up from his file. A young woman, her face pale, entered. A damp felt cap covered her black hair, and a long, dark coat was soaked with rain. She said nothing, just placed an envelope on the table. Her hands were shaking, her nails bitten off. Maigret recognized her. She lived on the floor above Nahour's office, had been briefly questioned, and then disappeared from the case as if she had never existed. I shouldn't have kept it," she said softly, her voice drowned out by the rain. "But they'll come looking for me if they know I gave it to you." Maigret opened the envelope. Inside was a black and white photograph of Nahour sitting in a cafe by the harbor. The light in the photo was low, a pale yellow oil lamp, but it was clear that the man sitting across from him was not one of the suspects. A small piece of paper clipped to the photo day 14. Before everything got bloody, Maigret turned the photograph under the light of the table lamp. On the edge of the wooden table, there was a semicircular cigarette burn, a mark so distinctive that even an observant man like himself could not miss it. He looked up, about to ask, but the woman had already backed away toward the door. "I don't know anything more. And don't look for me," she said, before disappearing into the dark hallway. Maigret sat still, the chill of the photograph spreading into his hand. This was more than a stray piece of the puzzle. It was a path to another case, one that might be even more dangerous than Nahour's. And he knew it. That path would take him away from Paris, south to Marseille, where the foggy port hid secrets that did not want to be exposed. He lit a cigarette, the smoke mingling with the smell of rain, and began planning to leave the city before dawn. Chapter 2. The night train to Marseille. The train whistle blew long and loud in the mist, a reminder that Paris was falling behind. Maigret sat in second class, his thick coat pulled high at the collar, his cap almost covering his eyes. In his hand, he still held the envelope containing the photograph, now tucked neatly into an inside pocket, close to his chest. The train was not crowded. A few people dozed. A few smoked quietly. The red glow of the fire reflected on the windows. Outside, the darkness passed quickly, only occasionally broken by the yellow lights of small stations. Maigret noticed a man sitting diagonally across from him. His face was thin, his cheekbones prominent, his eyes narrow, as if they were always squinting at the light or at the habit of observing. He carried no luggage but a small cloth bag, but his hands were calloused, with a fresh scratch on the back of his hand. When the train stopped at Dijon, the man did not get off, but leaned slightly to look out at the platform. Another figure appeared outside the window, tall, in a long coat, wearing a fedora, standing there for a few seconds and then disappearing. Maigret did not ask. He was used to these kinds of spying. One was on the same flight. One was following outside. And all appeared harmless. But in the silence, the tension built up like cigarette smoke in the cabin. As the train began to slow down in the early morning, the loudspeaker announcement of Marseille came hoarsely. Maigret stood up and gathered his things. The thin man stood too, but deliberately let Maigret go first. On the platform, the smell of salt and engine oil mingled with the sound of seagulls. In the distance, black steel cranes rose in the mist. Marseille greeted him with a bustling, chaotic atmosphere, and something hidden a promise or a threat. Maigret knew that if he stepped out of the station, he would be drawn into that vortex, and from that moment on, every step could lead to a dark harbor or a bloody dead end. Chapter 3. The Foggy Harbor. The morning fog in Marseille was so thick that silhouettes could only be seen a few meters away. As Maigret stepped out of the station, he pulled his coat tight around him, smelling the salty smell of the sea mixed with the rotting fish from the nearby market stalls. The cries of the vendors echoed, mixed with the sound of wooden carts rolling on the cobblestones. The old port wasn't far, but the road leading there was winding, past small, dimly lit cafes, with only a few late-night customers or sailors just arriving. The smell of roasting coffee mingled with the scent of brandy from the half-open doors. Maigret recognized a detail in the photograph, a rusty iron crane standing alone in the corner of the dock. Exactly the same shape and position as in the background. He stopped, lit a cigarette, and looked around. Wooden crates were lying around. Few sailors had scarves around their necks, their faces cold. From behind, a deep voice rang out. "Who are you looking for here, Inspector?" Maigret did not turn back immediately. He exhaled a cloud of smoke, then slowly replied, "Only looking for an answer." The one who spoke was a large man with a thick beard and wearing a dark blue sailor jacket. His eyes were full of scrutiny. Here, answers often come with a price. Maigret put down his cigarette and stamped it out. "I am willing to pay, if the information is worth it." The two men looked at each other for a long moment before the sailor signaled to follow. He led Maigret along the quay, around the old warehouses. The fog was thicker. The sound of the waves lapping at the shore was audible. Finally, they stopped in front of an abandoned warehouse with a rotten wooden door. The sailor said softly, "Inside is the man in your photo, but I advise not to trust anyone here." Maigret pushed the door open. Darkness fell in, and he knew this journey had just turned a corner from which there was no return. Chapter 4. The Man in the Photo. The smell of mold and rotting wood was strong inside the warehouse, mixed with the smell of salt seeping through the cracks in the roof. Faint light filtered through a few warped planks, casting pale streaks of light on the dusty floor. In the middle of the room sat a low wooden table covered with nautical charts and scribbled notes. Behind it sat a thin man in a wrinkled white shirt, open at the collar, a light coat draped over his shoulders. He looked up as Maigret entered, and it was the face from the photograph. The man's eyes were quietly searching, but there was a hint of panic deep within them before it was hidden by a polite smile. "I didn't expect to be so interested." "Inspector Maigret," he began. Maigret did not answer at once. He walked over to the table and lightly touched the map with his finger. "This is the sea route to North Africa. Are you going somewhere, or have you just returned from there?" The man chuckled. "Here, every journey has two stories, one to tell and one to hide." The sound of wooden floors creaking behind him. Maigret tilted his head slightly and recognized the bearded sailor standing near the door, his eyes constantly darting around as if on guard. A feeling of being surrounded crept in, but Maigret kept his voice calm. "I want to know about Nahour. That name is not unfamiliar to you." The man's smile faded. He leaned back in his chair. took a brown envelope from his desk drawer, placed it on the table, and pushed it toward Maigret. Here is the answer you want. But if you open it, there will be no turning back. Maigret looked at the envelope, then looked up. Outside, the train whistle sounded deep, like the beat of a game just beginning, and he understood. He had touched the heart of the matter. Chapter 5. Sealed envelopes. Maigret picked up the envelope. The paper felt dry and the edges stiff, as if it had just been sealed with thick glue. He turned it over and over, considering. From inside came the rustling of paper, but there was another sound too, like pieces of metal rubbing against each other. "Why give it to me?" Maigret asked, his eyes still on the envelope. The man folded his arms, his gaze half challenging, half pleading. "Because if I keep it for another day, I will die. As for you, you have a chance to survive if you know how to use it." Outside, the bearded sailor tapped lightly on the door, a signal. The man started, then tried to regain his composure. Maigret understood that time was running out. He stuffed the envelope into his coat pocket, keeping his eyes calm. "Do you know where Nahour is now?" "I know, but I can't say. At least not while I'm still in France." He paused, glanced quickly toward the door, and not here. The sea breeze blew in, and the map on the table was blown away, revealing a small photo underneath a group of men in suits, standing next to a half-open safe. Nahour's face was in the middle, cold as a statue. Maigret bent down to pick up the photograph, slowly putting it in his inner pocket. "I'll be back, and then you'll have to tell me everything." He turned and walked out, feeling the man's eyes on his back as the wooden door slammed shut. The fog had thickened on the dock, and the ship's whistle sounded like a warning now. The sealed envelope felt twice as heavy in his pocket. Maigret knew well whatever was inside, once opened, the game would have no way back. Chapter 6. In the mist of the old port, the fog rolled down like a white curtain, swallowing every street light along the quayside. Maigret stood in the yellow light, his hand in his pocket, feeling the sturdy envelope inside. He had not opened it yet, not because he was afraid, but because he knew that once the secret was revealed, everyone involved would immediately become prey. Footsteps echoed from behind, steady, deliberate. Maigret did not turn, but walked silently toward Madame Loiseau's old tavern, where a dim light still shone through the windows. The wooden door creaked as he entered, the smell of heavy wine and sea salt mingling. "Still the same?" Inspector asked Madame Loiseau, without looking up from the glass she was wiping. "Cognac. Hot," Maigret replied, and chose a table near the corner. From here, he could see both the entrance and the passage behind the counter. As the warmth of the wine spread through his hand, he pulled out the envelope. A thin, sharp knife cut through the paper. Inside, in addition to a stack of typewritten documents in French and Arabic, was a small, tarnished iron key. A separate sheet of paper, folded in four, fell onto the table. Just a few lines written in hasty, italicized handwriting. "If you're reading this, I'm dead. The key to safe number 4. Gare de Lyon. Inside is what Nahour feared most." A cold wind blew through the door, carrying with it the acrid smell of cigarette smoke. Maigret looked up in the street outside. The silhouette of a tall man had just disappeared into the mist. It was none other than the bearded sailor who had appeared that afternoon. Maigret knew he had been marked, and this little key and the opened envelope officially made him the only person standing between Nahour and the secret he was willing to kill to keep. He drained his glass, stood up, and walked outside into the mist, where the real game began. Chapter 7. Safe number 4. At the Gare de Lyon. Gare de Lyon. Early morning. The crowd is not yet large, but the first freight and passenger trains have begun to arrive. The loudspeaker calls the trains echoing on the glass dome, mixed with the sound of wheels grinding on the tracks. Maigret pulled his hat down low and pulled his coat up to his neck. In his pocket, the small iron key seemed to add weight. He passed the ticket counter and headed straight for the row of luggage lockers, cold gray blocks of metal, standing still like a row of silent tombs. Safe number 4 was in the lower corner, close to the wall. Before he bent down, Maigret glanced around. A man in a brown suit was reading a newspaper, but his eyes occasionally glanced in his direction. A woman in a red scarf was standing near the coffee counter, not drinking, but holding a cup. These details told him he was being watched. He inserted the key into the lock, turning it slowly, as if to stall for time to make the other person impatient. The lock clicked dryly, and the safe swung open. Inside was a long, old wooden box, tied with hemp rope. Before he could pull his hand out, a loud noise came from behind. Someone shouted, "Police! He has a bomb!" The crowd was in an uproar, jostling, and the sound of footsteps was rapid. The man in the brown suit folded his newspaper and rushed towards Maigret. At the same time, the woman in the red scarf slid forward from the left, her hand in her pocket. Maigret did not untie the rope, but simply tucked the wooden box under his arm, then quickly walked into the side corridor, joining the stream of people running. He knew that if he stopped, he would lose both the item and his life. At the end of the corridor, he suddenly turned down a staircase leading to the technical cellar, where the light was dim and the noise from the tracks overhead echoed down. With a gasp, Maigret realized this box contained not only evidence, but also bait to lure him into a trap that had been set in advance. The game is no longer about finding the truth. Now, someone wants him out of the game. Forever. Chapter 8. In the technical bunker. The air in the tunnel smelled of engine oil and rusted metal. Yellow lights hung in the air, flickering intermittently, casting shimmering shadows on the mottled cement walls. The rumble of the train overhead sounded like the pounding heartbeat of the entire station. Maigret walked quickly, his boots clicking on the cold iron floor. He found a hidden corner between two steam pipes to stop. The wooden box under his arm was damp with sweat. He took out his pocket knife and cut the hemp rope. The lid swung open, revealing a dark velvet interior. Nestled in the center was an old broom-handle Mauser revolver, the wood discolored. Beneath it was a thick envelope sealed with red wax. The seal bore a snake wrapped around a sword, a symbol he had seen in the files of an underground arms dealer in Marseille. Footsteps echoed from the end of the narrow corridor. A man's voice was hoarse, struggling to hold his breath. "Maigret, put it down." He turned slightly. From the darkness, the man in the brown suit from the station appeared. The yellow light illuminated his face, revealing a scar that ran from his cheekbone to his mouth. In his hand was a shiny Colt, pointed straight at him. "You don't understand. That stuff isn't for the police." "So who is it for?" Maigret asked, his voice even, but his eyes tense. The man took another step forward, gun still pointed. At that moment, from behind Maigret, there was the sound of boots clattering on the iron floor. The woman in the red scarf appeared, holding a folding knife with a shining silver blade in her hand. Caught between the two pursuers, Maigret felt the heat of the air duct on the back of his neck. The pieces began to fit together in his mind. The box, the snake seal, the recent disappearances in the port of Marseille. But before he could say anything, the ship's whistle blew loudly above, shaking the deck. Maigret seized the moment, hurling the box at the gunmen and darting aside. A shot rang out. The bullet lodged in the cement wall, creating a cloud of dust. The lights flickered. Shadows stretched out and overlapped. The game of hunting had turned into a fight for survival, and he knew that if he made one wrong move, he would disappear forever under the lion station. Chapter 9. Chess in the Dark. The heat from the pipes made the air as stifling as a boiler. Maigret pressed his back against the cold wall, his ears straining to distinguish each footstep over the rumble of the underground. The brown-suited man's shoes echoed slowly and steadily, while the red-hooded woman's voice was light and quick, like a cat stalking its prey. The wooden box rolled into a dark corner. A thin line of steam seeped from the pipe fitting, partially obscuring his vision. Maigret bent down, his hand groping for a piece of metal that had fallen to the floor, a forgotten wrench. He squeezed it, feeling its cold weight. "You won't get away, Inspector." The woman's voice rang out, sweet but poisonous. "And if I say I don't intend to escape?" Maigret replied, trying to keep his voice calm. From the darkness, the man in the brown suit chuckled softly. "Then you were wise. Give me the envelope. As for the gun, you can keep it as a souvenir." Maigret stepped forward half a step, letting the dim light fall on his face. "Do you think I believe in such a negotiation?" The man raised his gun, preparing to pull the trigger. At the same time, Maigret threw the wrench into the air duct right above his head. There was a loud bang, and white-hot steam sprayed down, filling the hallway. Curses and gunshots scattered in the mist. Maigret rushed to the box, tucked it into his coat, and slid down a narrow passageway that was barely wide enough for one person. The sound of boots followed him, so close he could hear his breathing. The corridor led up a spiral staircase of iron, which shook with every step. As he reached the top of the stairs, he saw a third figure waiting, a tall, thin man in a fedora, his gray eyes watching him silently, without asking. Maigret realized that this was no casual passerby, but the next link in the deadly game. He smiled, holding out his hand to him, Inspector. I believe that what you are holding belongs to me. Chapter 10. The Third Hand. Maigret stood frozen in the doorway, his breath still smelling of cold pipes and gunpowder. The tall, thin man with the gray eyes showed no sign of hurrying. He took a step forward, his shadow stretching out on the wet concrete, as if he wanted to swallow the inspector. You know, I'm not in the habit of waiting long, he said, his voice low and soft as old velvet. Maigret did not reply. Beneath his coat, the wooden box pressed against his chest, heavy as a stone. He could feel his heart beating against it. From behind, hurried footsteps sounded. The man in the brown suit and the woman in the red scarf had escaped the steam and were now closing the distance. Maigret was caught between three people, each of whom wanted the object he carried. If I give it to you, I will have to trust you more than the other two, Maigret asked, half mockingly. No, Inspector, you will have to believe that I need you to live a little longer. He waved his hand to signal. Another figure appeared from the iron stairs, a skinny, wild-eyed teenager holding a shining dagger. The entire narrow space instantly smelled of metal and danger. Maigret slowly removed the box from his shirt, but did not hand it over. He took a step back, his eyes darting toward a metal door to his left. His only escape route. Okay, but we'll talk outside. He pointed to the door. It's too stuffy in here. The tall, thin man gave an unfathomable smile, then nodded. Go ahead, Inspector. But remember, any rash move will end with you lying here. Maigret pushed open the door. The night wind rushed in, carrying with it the smell of gasoline and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks. They had reached the edge of the harbor, where yellow lights illuminated small boats gently bobbing on the water. He knew that in a moment he would have to choose hand over the box, or use it to change the whole situation. Chapter 11. water on blood. The sea breeze whistled through the mooring lines, blowing the smoke from Maigret's lips. Across the water, the lights of the harbor stretched out in trembling golden streaks, as if trying to hide what awaited below. The tall, thin man signaled the dagger boy to stand behind Maigret, while the man in the brown suit and the woman in the red scarf kept their distance, but did not move away. 3 sides, 4 people, and an object that made everyone ready to kill each other. Give it to me, and you will leave here with both life and honor, Inspector, said the tall, thin man, his eyes following Maigret's every move, as if he were nothing more than prey waiting for his turn. Maigret took a step toward the quayside railing. Below him, the water was black, lapping gently against the concrete piers, creating a slow but uneasy rhythm. Honor. He curled his lips. I've seen enough to know that that thing doesn't save anyone when blood touches water. As soon as he finished speaking, Maigret suddenly turned around and threw the box over the harbor wall. The loud splash was like the opening shots. "You're crazy, the tall, thin man roared, rushing to the railing. But Maigret had thought ahead in the chaos. He threw his shoulder back and rammed the dagger-wielding boy. The knife fell, skidding across the wet cement and disappearing into the darkness. The woman in the red scarf screamed and rushed towards the water, while the man in the brown vest drew his pistol. Maigret ducked low, avoiding the bullet that tore through the wind, and then dove into the shadow of a nearby boat. Salt wind, the sound of waves, the smell of engine oil, and a deadly silence fell on the harbor. He knew the hunt had begun, and this time he was the prey everyone was looking for. Chapter 12. Wind and Iron Trap. The first sound Maigret heard was the pounding of hobnailed boots on the wooden bridge. Pursuit from 3 directions. The sound of gunfire still in the wind, and the heavy breathing of those ready to end it all right there. He slipped through the narrow gap between the 2 containers, his hands touching the cold, greasy steel. The smell of salt and rust mixed together, making the air thick. High above, headlights swept across, leaving faint yellow streaks of light, chasing his figure like a predator. The footsteps changed direction. They had split up. Maigret stopped, leaning against the wall of the container, listening. One was advancing, another was circling from the dock, and a lighter set of heels, the woman in red, was creeping behind. blocking the way. Maigret picked up a piece of iron chain that had fallen beside him, heavy and cold as a warning. He moved silently toward the old crane, where the cable hung suspended over an iron cage filled with steel plates. The figure in the brown suit appeared first, his gun raised. Maigret waited for the moment when he stepped into the light, then threw the chain into the cable lock. With a loud click, the cage fell free. The heavy mass of steel fell, blocking the passage with a sound like a cannon. The brown vest flew back. The gun fell into the water. His screams mixed with the curses of the tall and thin man on the opposite side. The woman in the red scarf stopped, her eyes showing a hint of hesitation. Maigret wasted no time. He slipped through another passage toward the old cold storage room, where he believed that if he could just close a door, the game would change hands. Outside, the sea wind still howled, accompanied by the clanging of chains like a death knell. Chapter 13. Cold Storage and Confession. The door of the old cold storage room creaked open, and the damp air hit Maigret in the face. The abandoned wooden shelves, still stained yellow from when they had once been filled with iced fish, were now as bare as the ribs of a long dead animal. The light from a single hanging lamp fell on the mottled cement floor, where puddles of melted water distorted reflections. He pressed his back against the door, listening. The pounding footsteps were nearer 2, not 3. The tall, thin man and the woman in the red scarf. The brown vest was probably still pinned down by the steel, if not worse. Their silhouettes passed through the doorway. Maigret stepped out of the shadows, holding the chain. The sound of metal hitting the floor made them both stop. "Let's talk." His voice was low and even, but there was something in it that sent a chill down one's spine. The woman glanced quickly at her companion, then pulled a small pistol from her coat. Maigret did not move, only tilted his head slightly toward the wooden shelves, where the light revealed a detail on the shelf was a black leather bag, the zipper slightly open. "Whose bag is that?" he asked, sounding as if he already knew the answer. The tall man pursed his lips. The woman took a half step back, the gun still pointed. But then her hand trembled slightly as Maigret continued, each word falling heavily. "In there is what killed Nahour, and if opened, It will reveal who was behind it all. The room was dead silent, except for the sound of water dripping from the metal pipe. The woman lowered her gun first, her eyes filled with despair. She let out a sigh as if accepting her fate, then whispered, "You don't know. It's all just part of a bigger plan." Maigret stepped closer, still holding the chain. He knew that this statement would open a rift, and if he was careful, the whole truth would flow out like the ice melting beneath their feet. Chapter 14. Cracks in the Plan. Maigret kept his gaze fixed on the woman, his gaze both cold and patient. In the cold storage, the breath of all three rose in thin wisps, then dissipated into the musty darkness. "What is the rest of the plan?" he asked, his voice even, not pressing, but forcing the other person to speak. The woman glanced at the tall man. He shook his head, but there was more fear in his shake than disapproval. She bit her lip, her hand unconsciously tightening on the strap of her leather bag. "You think Nahour is the ultimate target, He's just a pawn. Someone wants to create a blow to the entire Paris business world. An explosion, not with gunpowder, but with information." Maigret said nothing, but took half a step forward. The tall man backed away, his foot hitting the wooden shelf, making a creaking sound. "What's inside the bag?" he asked. She opened the zipper. The sound of iron scraping against metal echoed in the cold room. Inside, under a layer of old oil paper, was a thick file, its edges frayed, its cover stamped in red confidential, the list of those who have received money from Nahour. "And the one behind him," she said softly, "if made public, there will be names that will shake the city." Maigret glanced at the tall man. He bowed his head and muttered, as if confessing, "We were only hired to retrieve it, not to keep it." But now the sound of police sirens echoed in the distance, getting closer and closer. Maigret realized that time was running out. He had to decide keep the file quiet and lead to the ringleader, or submit it immediately to ensure that the evidence did not disappear. The cold storage became so quiet that he could hear his own heartbeat. Chapter 15. The Second Trap. Maigret stood still, the coldness of the cement floor seeping up his spine. He did not reply immediately, but bent slightly and turned the file over with his thumb. The names that appeared so familiar that he had to suppress a gasp. "Have you read it all?" he asked. his eyes still glued to the words. The woman shook her head slightly. The tall, thin man swallowed. We only know there was money and a few letters. The specific contents are unknown. Maigret closed the file, then walked over to the small wooden table in the corner of the room. He took a white envelope from his coat pocket and placed it on the table as if he had prepared it beforehand. Here are copies of some documents which you have just risked your life to obtain. I made them this afternoon when I suspected that this case was more than a murder. The other two looked at him, astonished. The original will remain with me. This copy. Maigret picked it up, glancing at the closed window, will fall into the hands of the man you call master. We shall see what he does when he thinks he has it. The police siren sounded closer. Maigret tilted his head slightly. And you will cooperate. Or else. He didn't need to finish. The cold and the sound of approaching footsteps spoke for themselves. The woman nodded slowly. The tall, thin man sighed, as if accepting his fate. Maigret opened the door and led them outside. The Paris night was damp, the street lights casting patches of yellow light. In his mind, the second trap was closing, but this time it was aimed not at a single murderer, but at a network of power hidden in the shadows. Chapter 16. Prey comes to light. 3 days later, Paris seemed unchanged. The streets were still wet with rain. The cafes were still full of chatter. And crowds still walked the sidewalks, oblivious to the fact that an invisible rope was tightening around the neck of a powerful man. In his office on the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret stood by the window, his pipe in hand, but unlit. On the desk, the copy envelope he had deliberately left exposed now lay inside another envelope with fresh fingerprints and subtle signs of having been opened and closed. Just as he had predicted, the reconnaissance team had been following her since the woman handed over the documents to an unknown intermediary. From then on, her journey was like a hooked fish being pulled back to the fisherman's boat. A brief knock on the door. Lucas entered, placing a freshly developed black and white photograph before him. A gray-haired man in an expensive overcoat, shaking hands with a senator at a dinner party the night before. His face was calm, but Maigret saw a barely concealed tension at the corners of his mouth. Master Lucas asked. Maigret nodded. He knows he's being hunted. but he thinks we're not sure. And that's when he makes a mistake. He turned to look at the map of Paris hanging on the wall, his finger touching a red dot in Montparnasse. Tonight, he will meet with one of his trusted henchmen to discuss how to solve the dossier problem. We will let him believe that everything is under control until he walks into the room where someone is waiting. Maigret lit a cigarette. Smoke billowed, swirling in the yellow light of the table lamp. The prey is out in the light, Lucas, and this time there will be no turning back. Chapter 17. The room with no exit. The room was on the third floor of an old cafe on Delambre Street, a place that few people would have noticed. The yellow light was dim, and the smell of old wine and cigarettes mingled. Outside, a drizzle fell, fogging the glass, making it difficult to see the street from inside. The gray-haired man walked in, his coat still dripping with rain. He glanced around and saw his accomplice sitting at a corner table. On the table was a small combination-locked suitcase. "We must act quickly," he said, his voice low but urgent. If the file falls into Maigret's hands before he could finish, the door behind him closed softly. Two figures entered. Maigret walked in first, a pipe in the corner of his mouth, followed by Lucas. No one said anything. The grizzled man stood up abruptly, but Maigret raised his hand, a gentle but firm gesture. "No need. You knew this would come, didn't you?" He tried to smile, but his eyes kept glancing toward the window, as if measuring his escape. "Inspector, you are mistaken." "Mistaken," Maigret interrupted, slowly placing a thick envelope on the table. "The original, not a copy. And your fingerprints from when you opened it at the woman's house." The air was heavy. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Lucas stood in the doorway, blocking any possibility of retreat. Maigret sat down, his eyes never leaving the other. "You play this game well, giving money to the desperate, buying the silence of the concerned, using power to bend the truth. But there is one thing you forget: patience. I can wait, and when I wait long enough, all your paths will lead here." He did not answer. Only the click of the combination lock on the suitcase his companion had opened it, revealing the remaining wads of money and a few documents. Maigret glanced at it, then turned to Lucas call a cab. We'll finish at the Quai des Orfèvres. As he was led away, he remained calm, but his hands clenched as if he wanted to crush his fedora. The door closed, leaving the room with only smoke, the smell of rain, and the feeling that a long chapter of the game had been closed. Chapter 18. The Final Confession. The Quai des Orfèvres interrogation room was bathed in cold white light. An old wooden table stood in the middle of the room, on which was an open suitcase, money and files arranged in an odd order, as if they still had power, even though they had been stripped from their owner. Maigret sat opposite, his hands clasped together, his pipe placed aside. Lucas stood near the door, saying nothing, but his eyes were alert. The gray-haired man looked around, took a deep breath, and leaned back in his chair. Which do you want to hear first? About money or about blood? Maigret did not blink. About blood. Money is always the same. A soft laugh rang out, thin as a taut wire. It wasn't murder, not what you think. She fell. I just did what Maigret interrupted, his voice low and even. Just used that death, hiding it, turning it into another story, to protect someone, or maybe to protect myself. Maigret tilted his head, his eyes scrutinizing every word. And who is that? Silence. Only the steady tapping of Lucas's pen could be heard. The man slowly lowered his head, rubbing his hands together as if seeking warmth. A man who, if I tell you, you will never be able to sleep peacefully again, because you know him too. Maigret's expression did not change, but an unreadable light flashed in the depths of his eyes. He stood up, picked up his suitcase, and said, "We will talk more, but not tonight." The man was taken away. The iron door slammed shut, leaving Maigret alone with the smell of unburnt cigarettes and a feeling that this story was not over yet. Chapter 19. The Name in the Dark. The Paris night was as thick as ink. Outside the Quai des Orfèvres, the Seine flowed silently, reflecting the yellow lights in long, trembling streaks. Maigret stood alone by the window, looking down at the water, his pipe glowing red in his hand. He thought not of the man who had just been arrested, but of the sentence that had left a scar on his memory. Yes, you know him too. Maigret turned and walked slowly into the office, where Lucas was waiting with an open file. We reviewed the cases from the past 10 years. There was one name that came up over and over again, but never charged, Lucas said, his voice low, as if the walls could hear him. Maigret pulled up a chair, sat down, and flipped through the file. The name was on the third page, between the lines of old typewriter Albert Nahour, a businessman of Lebanese origin, specializing in import and export of goods. But rumor had it that behind it was a network of money laundering and arms smuggling. Maigret tapped his fingers on the table. He had met Nahour before at a charity dinner on the Champs-Élysées, where he shook hands with a polite smile. But his eyes were cold and leaden. "Is there any evidence?" Maigret asked. "Not enough to convict. He always stands behind others. This time, it seems the prisoner is trying to shield him." Maigret leaned back, looking at the ceiling. He knew that if he rushed into Nahour, there would be no turning back. But the story had gone beyond a single case. It was a web. And someone had just opened the door for him to enter. Outside, the church clock struck 12. A new night had begun. And in the darkness of Paris, the name Nahour was like an ink stain, slowly swallowing everything. Chapter 20. The thread between Maigret and Nahour. The next morning, Maigret sat in a small cafe on the boulevard Saint-Germain. He was not wearing his usual overcoat, but a simple cloth jacket and a felt hat pulled low. A cup of black coffee steamed in front of him, but he did not drink it. The glass door rattled as the bus passed by, and through it he could see the man sitting in the cafe opposite. He didn't look directly at Maigret, but his eyes behind his sunglasses darted over every few minutes. There was no doubt he was Nahour's man. Lucas had reported this morning. One of our men was followed on his way home last night, and the office phones were tapped. Nahour didn't wait to be attacked. He attacked first. Maigret pretended to read his newspaper, but his eyes kept on the edge of the page. He did not intend to confront his stalker directly. Instead, he wanted him to believe that he was in control. Only when the other person was most confident would he be vulnerable. He dropped a few coins on the table, stood up, and walked out into the street. A cold wind swept past, carrying with it the smell of fresh bread from a nearby shop. Maigret did not turn around, but he felt the footsteps behind him. Instead of going back to the Quai des Orfèvres, he turned into a small alley that led to the old dockyards, once a rendezvous for bootleggers during the Prohibition. It now smelled of oil and rotting wood. Maigret stepped further into the darkness, then stopped. The footsteps behind him faltered. "My friend," Maigret said in a low voice, "if Nahour wants to see me, tell him I am looking for him too." Without waiting for an answer, Maigret stepped into the light, leaving the other standing silently in the darkness. He knew that this message would reach Nahour before nightfall, and the real hunting game would begin. Chapter 21. The Letter Without a Signer. That evening, when Maigret returned home, his wife met him at the door, looking a little puzzled. "Someone brought this afternoon. They didn't leave their name." She handed him a thick yellow envelope without a postmark. Maigret sat down at the table and turned on the yellow overhead light. The small room was warm, but the air turned cold as he opened the envelope. Inside was a sheaf of typewritten paper, held together with a staple, and the first sheet contained only one line. "If you still want to know why Nahour returned to Paris, read on." He unpinned it and turned the pages. The writing was steady and cold, detailing a murder that had taken place 7 years earlier in Marseille. A Lebanese businessman had been murdered, but the man convicted was someone else entirely, a sailor with no previous convictions or grudges, who had confessed after a night of interrogation. The last page was a copy of an old telegram, signed Nahour. But what made Maigret frown was the address, a Parisian trading office he knew well, one that had been involved in a diamond smuggling case he had investigated but never solved. Who had sent this letter? Someone who wanted to help him, or someone who was trying to manipulate him? Outside, a light rain had begun to fall. Maigret folded the papers, stood up, and knew that tomorrow morning he would have to open the old file again. Nahour is not just the target of a present case. He is dragging Maigret into a labyrinth of the past. Chapter 22. The Marseille files reopen. The next morning, Maigret appeared at the police station, his coat still damp from the night's rain. He carried a yellow envelope, and in his pocket was the notebook he had used since the Nahour affair. The archives were in the basement, where fluorescent light shone on shelves of hardback files. The familiar smell of old, damp paper and dust made him feel as if he were entering a graveyard of memories. The secretary handed him a file marked Marseille, Murder of Said Karoun, 19XX. Turning the pages, Maigret noticed small irregularities that no one had noticed at the time. The convicted sailor's interrogation record was only 1 page long, but noted that he gave a full confession without giving details of his testimony. The testimony of a single witness was typewritten, without a handwritten signature. The crime scene photo is missing part of the corner that should have shown the direction the blood trail led into the alley. He underlined in pencil a passage from the inspector in charge of the case. Information from reliable sources indicates that the victim was involved in both legal and illegal commercial activities in Paris. The source was not named. As Maigret closed the file, he knew one thing for sure: the murder of Said Karoun was the work of smugglers, and that the network was still alive. Nahour had not just returned to Paris by chance. He was in the middle of a battle he did not fully understand. On his way out of the archives, he met Lucas. "Sir, Nahour was seen last night in a bar near the Gare de Lyon, but he was not alone. There was a woman, black hair, red coat. We have not yet determined her identity." Maigret paused, frowning. In the old telegram, there was a mention of an M, name or code. It was unclear. Perhaps it was her. He knew he had to see Nahour before someone could silence him or her. Chapter 23. The Woman in Red. It was dusk in Paris, the yellow lights reflecting off the rain-soaked pavement. Maigret sat in his old Citroën, just a few meters from the bar, near the Gare de Lyon. Cigarette smoke hung in the cabin as he silently watched the entrance. The bar was called Les Phares, a haunt of porters, long-distance drivers, and smugglers. The door swung open, and out stepped the woman, long black hair, a red coat that stood out from the crowd. Next to her was Nahour, her face tense, as if she were counting the seconds until she could be out of sight. Lucas reported softly over the radio. She turned onto Rue de Bercy. "Sir?" Maigret opened the car door, his heels clicking on the wet pavement. He kept his distance, enough to be inconspicuous, but not lost. The two in front stopped in front of an old building. The license plate blurred with dust. The iron door closed behind them, cutting off the street light. He pressed his ear to the cold door frame, hearing only the faint echoes of conversation. One word came out clearly: Marseille. A tall figure suddenly appeared from around the corner, blocking Maigret's path. His face was hidden by a low woolen cap. His hands were stuffed into the pockets of a thick coat. His instincts told him that this was no coincidence. "Who are you looking for here?" His voice was harsh, without any intention of invitation. Maigret did not reply, but lit a cigarette, the smoke drifting across the stranger's face. Their eyes locked for a few seconds before the sound of a police siren rang out from the other end of the street. The figure turned away immediately, disappearing into the dark alley. Maigret knew the circle around Nahour was tightening, but what worried him more was the woman in red. She was not just a lover or a collaborator. She had the appearance of an informant in the cases he had witnessed, and informants were often dead before they could open their mouths. Chapter 24. The Trap on the Rue de Bercy. The rain began to fall heavily, the drops hitting Maigret's collar. Cold, he stood in the darkness, his eyes still fixed on the iron door that had swallowed Nahour and the woman in red. The street lamps cast a dull yellow light, blotchy on the cobblestones. Lucas appeared at the end of the street, his breath coming out in clouds. "There's a back door inside. Boss, I've got torrents blocking it." Maigret nodded slightly, stubbed out his cigarette against the wall, the smell of burning permeating the damp night air. He signaled Lucas to follow, then walked towards the door. With a deft turn of the steel latch, the lock clicked quietly. Inside was a long corridor, flickering with fluorescent lights, damp and smelling of strong alcohol. Footsteps echoed from the upper floors, mingled with the scraping of chairs on wooden floors. Maigret signaled for silence. They moved step by step, long shadows on the walls like flickering figures. The door at the end of the corridor was ajar, and a golden light flooded in. Maigret peered through the crack. Nahour was sitting back in his chair, swirling his wine glass, and the woman in red was standing in front of him. Her voice was low and urgent. They want the goods in Marseille next week. If they're late, you know. Nahour sneered, but his hand shook slightly. He was about to say more when another man stepped out from the corner of the room, holding a revolver. "We have an uninvited guest," he said, looking straight at the door where Maigret stood. Maigret stepped back in time, signaling Lucas. Footsteps were pounding inside. There was no time. He decided instead of retreating, he would force them to reveal themselves. Police Maigret's voice boomed, and the door swung open, revealing them all in a blinding light. But at that moment, the woman in red pulled a thick envelope from her handbag and threw it through the open window. A black car parked outside, its engine running, immediately sped away through the rain. Maigret understood that he had raised the alarm too early, and that the person holding the key to the case was now out of reach. Chapter 25. The Chase Across the River. The black car turned sharply at the end of the street, the wheels skidding through the rain, splashing. Maigret and Lucas rushed out of the building, the cold air hitting their faces. Torrance, hearing Lucas's shout, turned the ignition and started the engine immediately. "Stick with him," Maigret shouted, sliding into the back seat. The police car sped away, its engine roaring on the slick pavement. The street lights receded, leaving behind a damp darkness and the stench of gasoline. Ahead, the black car's taillights gleamed red, weaving through intersections like an eel hiding in a maelstrom. The banks of the Seine came into view, the gray water shimmering in the lights. The car suddenly braked and turned onto a cobblestone road that ran parallel to the embankment. The long, distant whistle of a train echoed, mixed with the steady patter of rain on the roof of the car. "They want to get out of Paris via Pont Sully," Lucas guessed. "No, they intend to disappear into the warehouses," Maigret replied, his eyes fixed on his target. True to his word, the black car pulled into a dark area where rows of old warehouses stood. The smell of damp wood and rusted iron heavy. Torrance turned off the headlights as ordered, and the car crept forward silently. The engine of the other car stopped somewhere ahead. "Walk from here." Maigret opened the door, stepped out, hat pulled low to protect against the rain. They squeezed between the large crates, their wet boots clicking on the concrete. In the space between the two warehouses, the shadow of a man jumped out of the truck and picked up the envelope he had thrown. Maigret was about to rush forward when a shot rang out, a loud, piercing sound. The bullet lodged itself in the wooden crate beside him, and a splinter of wood hit his cheek. The man did not run, but stood still, the gun pointed straight ahead, his eyes glinting in the distant yellow light. "Don't come any further, Maigret." His voice was low, hoarse, and uncomfortably familiar. Maigret paused. He had heard that voice in an old file, a case he had thought he had closed years ago. Chapter 26. The One Who Returned from the Past. The rain fell harder, the curtain of water blurring the yellow light at the end of the dock. Maigret stood motionless, the chill coming not only from the river's vapor, but also from the memories that were stirring. The man before him lowered his gun slightly, but his eyes remained alert. His face was thin, his cheeks sunken, his wet hair stuck to his forehead, but that square jaw and that crooked smile Maigret had seen. "Léo Marchand!" Maigret exclaimed. The man raised his eyebrows. His lips pursed as if to suppress a sneer. "It's been years, Inspector. I thought you'd forgotten me." "It's hard to forget a man who killed 3 people and escaped justice," Maigret replied, his voice heavy as lead. Lucas, who was hiding behind a crate, moved forward slightly, but Maigret raised his hand to stop him. In this situation, if he was reckless, one mistake would result in blood. Leo pulled a thick envelope from his pocket and threw it into the puddle. "Is this what you want? Or do you want to know why Nahour died?" The question stabbed Maigret like a knife into his mind. From the beginning, all the clues pointed to a murder for money. But now, before him, a man from the dark past stepped out, bringing with him a history of blood and betrayal. "You don't understand, Maigret," Leo said, his voice low. "Nahour is just a link. The whole thing is a chess game. And I'm just picking up the old game where you left off." The train whistle echoed from the other side, long and sharp like a slash into the night. Maigret knew that if he let him disappear again, he would not have a third chance. But if he pressed on now, the truth hidden in the mud of the past would be completely submerged. In a moment, Maigret realized the Nahour case did not end here. It had just opened a new investigation, where the roles of the perpetrator and the victim had changed, and the rules of the game were no longer the same. Chapter 27. Blood Chess. The rain lashed the river like 1,000 needles, but both Maigret and Leo stood still, each locked in a tense silence. "What do you want from me?" Marchand Maigret asked, his voice low and firm. I want to live. And to live, I need you," Leo replied, his eyes flashing coldly. "There is someone, no, a group, hunting us both. Nahour is just a sacrificial pawn." Maigret realized that he was not lying, even in the darkness. The slight movements of his eyes, the way his hand gripped the hilt of his gun as if seeking some measure of safety, told the truth. Leo was being pushed into a corner. "Give me the name," said Maigret. Leo shook his head slightly. "A name only makes sense when you understand the whole board. And this board, you were the first to place your piece." His words were like a punch to Maigret's memory. Images of the Le Havre case from years ago flashed back to him, a botched arms smuggling operation. A man who escaped in the middle of the night, and secret reports that had never made it into the official files. Lucas stepped out of hiding, gun drawn. "Boss, we'll take him now." Maigret held up his hand. "No, he's coming with us now." Lucas looked at his boss, surprised. "Come along. Are you serious?" "Very serious," Maigret replied, his eyes never leaving Leo. "If Marchand is right, whoever is behind Nahour will stop at nothing. And to catch him, we need a prey that knows the way back to the wolf's den." Leo gave a faint smile, both ironic and confident. "I am not the bait. I will lead the way. But remember this, Inspector, once you enter this game, there is no retreat." Maigret breathed deeply, the dampness of the rainy night. He knew he had just entered a game whose rules were not determined by the police, and where blood would be the only thing that would determine the course of action. Chapter 28. Darkness in the Old Files. The archive room on the Quai des Orfèvres smelled of old paper, damp and slightly dusty. Yellow light shone down on the tall wooden shelves, where thousands of files were stacked like layers of memories that no one wanted to touch. Maigret pulled open a rusted steel drawer. The metal scraped against each other As if protesting at being awakened after years of slumber, he pulled out a file bound in dark cloth, with a faded label on its spine, Le Havre, 1936. Arms smuggling. Lucas stood by, trying to see over his boss's shoulder. This case, I've never heard you mention it. Maigret didn't reply. He flipped through the pages, his eyes darting over typewritten reports, interspersed with water-stained black and white photographs. An old ship, moored in the harbor on a rainy night. Closed wooden crates, the markings not matching the declarations, and a name underlined several times in red: Jean-Paul Renault. Leo Marchand spoke from the corner of the room, his voice full of meaning. Do you remember him? Renault, the one who saved Nahour from a hit in Casablanca. Maigret looked up, staring straight at Leo. And the one who disappeared after the smuggling operation collapsed. All clues died with him. Until now. Lucas frowned. Sir, you think Renaud is the mastermind? More than just the mastermind, Maigret said quietly, his voice dropping. If I'm right, he's built a whole underground network, arms trafficking, money laundering, and eliminating anyone who poses a threat. Nahour is just one link, and so is Leo. Leo smiled faintly, but did not deny it. He knows how to hide. Even you, Maigret, missed him for 2 decades. Maigret slammed the file shut, the sound like a full stop. No more missing. From now on, we will trace all the clues, starting with those who owed Renaud his life. And believe me, the list is longer than you think. Outside the window, Paris was still raining, the drops rolling down like slow lines of time. In Maigret's eyes, the darkness of the past had just opened up, dragging along a quagmire that he knew, once he stepped into it, there would be no turning back. Chapter 29. Bait on the Seine. That night, the Seine rolled in murky waves, reflecting the yellow lights of the bridges like knives across the water. On a deserted wharf near the Pont de Bercy, an old barge was loosely moored, its paint peeling. But inside was a meticulously staged stage. Maigret stood with his arms crossed, his shoulders swathed in a thick overcoat, the smoke of his cigarette wafting through the humid air beside him Leo Marchand adjusted the small radio hidden in his pocket. The communications were encrypted on a single frequency that Lucas's surveillance team could pick up. "Are you sure Renault will come?" Leo asked, his voice so low it was almost carried away by the wind. As sure as he would never let anyone hold goods unchecked, Maigret replied, his eyes never leaving the black water. Inside the barge, Lucas and two undercover cops were stacking wooden crates. From the outside, they looked like a newly arrived shipment of contraband, but inside, they were just heavy blocks of lead, enough to fool any casual observer. The dull hum of an engine echoed in the distance. A small motorboat appeared around the bend of the river, its headlights scanning like a predatory eye. Leo frowned. Right on time. The boat drew up beside the barge. 4 figures leaped aboard, moving quickly and precisely. One of them, tall and thin, wearing a fedora pulled down almost completely over his face, stood apart. Surveying the scene, Maigret recognized that posture. Calm, confident, never in a hurry. Jean-Paul Renault. Maigret inclined his head. Lucas immediately signaled, but at that moment, one of the crates burst open, and instead of weapons, there was only lead. Renault looked up, the corners of his lips curling into a cold smile. Old man, still up to the same old tricks. Immediately, the lights from the riverbank turned on. Footsteps were running, but Renault reacted as expected. He pulled out his gun and fired a shot into the oil tank on the side of the barge. The loud explosion shook the river, and water and smoke billowed into the air. In the chaos, Renault disappeared as if melting into the darkness of the Seine, leaving Maigret standing motionless, his hand clutching the cigarette that had been extinguished. "We just lost him," Leo gasped. Maigret did not turn around, only said softly, "No. From now on, he will think I am always right behind him, and that is when he will show his weakness." In the distance, the foghorn echoed, long and cold, as if signaling the beginning of a chase. Chapter 30. The Letter Without Fingerprints. The next morning, the office on the Quai des Orfèvres was bathed in the cold light of a rainy, gray day. On Maigret's desk, among the unsorted files, there was a cream-colored envelope neatly placed, as if someone had put it down only a few minutes before. Lucas entered, coffee in hand, frowning at the envelope. No one recognized the person who brought it. Maigret asked, still staring at the small object. No, sir. The receptionist said they saw only a man in a long raincoat and a hood. He handed over the envelope and left immediately. Maigret put on gloves and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a white sheet of paper with a single line written in black ink. While you were looking for me, I was standing right behind you. No signature, no trace. The ink still smelled a little pungent, as if it had just dried. Maigret held the paper up to the light. His eyes narrowed. No fingerprints, no impressions. As if the writer had planned every detail. Renaud Lucas guessed. Maybe. Maigret replied, his voice lower. Or someone else wants us to believe it. He tapped the paper on the table, thinking it was just one line. But the way it appeared, silently, precisely, in the safest place was a clear message the sender wanted him to know, that any plan to trap him could be seen through. Maigret turned to Lucas. Have someone check all the cameras around here for the past 3 hours. And tell Janvier to come. We need to compile a list of people who were able to access the building without being checked. As Lucas left, Maigret lit a cigarette. He remembered the look in Renaud's eyes last night, when he saw the lead barrels, not quite angry, not quite surprised, but as if testing him. The rain pattered on the windows. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Slow, deliberate. Maigret turned, but the corridor was empty. He took a long drag of smoke and said softly, All right, Renaud. The game is just beginning. Chapter 31. The Invisible Monitor. In the afternoon, the rain continued to fall, as if trying to erase all traces on the streets of Paris. Maigret stood by the window, looking down at the narrow street in front of the headquarters. People were hurrying about, their necks tucked into their coats. But in the midst of the crowd, he recognized a still figure, a man in a dark raincoat, his hood obscuring his face. Not Renaud, thinner, smaller in stature, and most importantly, he made no attempt to avoid Maigret's gaze. He stood up straight, his head slightly raised, as if to let Maigret know he was there. Lucas Maigret called, not taking his eyes off the scene. When Lucas arrived, He pointed the man in the black raincoat next to the bakery. Don't let him know I'm watching. Go around the back. Lucas disappeared. But less than a minute later, the raincoat figure turned into a narrow alley and disappeared from sight. Maigret tightened his grip on his cigarette, clearly feeling that he and Renaud were no longer the only two people on this chessboard. That evening, when Maigret returned to his small apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, everything was quieter than usual. He hung up his raincoat and put his hat on the rack. When he noticed another envelope tucked under the door, this time the paper inside contained only 2 words. I know. No address. No explanation. Same ink as morning's letter. He sat down in a chair, opened his notebook, and wrote down everything: the time, the weather, the position of the raincoat, the contents of the 2 letters. It was clear that this was a third party, not entirely on Renaud's side, but not on the side of the police either. Someone watching, waiting, and intervening at the right moment. Maigret wondered, was this someone who wanted to help, or just someone who enjoyed seeing the game become more chaotic? Outside the window, the street lights reflected off the puddles, looking like eyes watching him. He knew that from now on, every step he took would not only be followed by Renaud, but also by another invisible watcher. Chapter 32. The Second Trap. Maigret sat in his study all night, cigarette smoke swirling around him like a mysterious fog. On the table was a map of the neighborhood where Renaud often appeared. Each alley and each shop marked with its own symbols. But this time, he wasn't just hunting Renaud. He wanted to drag the mysterious raincoat man into the game. Lucas walked in late in the morning, carrying hot coffee. Sir, the raincoat guy from yesterday. No one at the bakery recognized him. It was like he was there, just for a moment to show us. Maigret took a sip of coffee, his eyes thoughtful. Yes, and if he deliberately let us see, it means he wants to send a message, or a warning, or a provocation. He began drawing 2 circles on the map, one for Renaud's likely area of operation, the other for the stalker's vantage points. We'll set 2 traps, one for Renaud, one for him. But both will happen at the same time, to see who gets in first. That night, A woman acting as decoy was placed on a narrow street near the river, the site of an old crime in which Renault was suspected 2 blocks away. Lucas disguised himself as an electrician and set up a makeshift station to keep an eye on passers-by. Maigret stood in a corner of the tavern, watching silently through the frosted glass. The clock on the wall moved slowly. The rain continued to fall, wetting the silhouettes and the street lights. Then he saw him, the man in the black raincoat, who had appeared from the alley, paused for a few seconds, his eyes scanning the area. But before Maigret could signal Lucas, Renault, from the opposite direction, entered the scene as if they had met by chance. They both stopped, looking at each other. There was a tense silence. Renault smiled faintly. The man in the raincoat tilted his head slightly. Then they both turned away, disappearing in 2 different directions. Maigret understood one thing: these 2 men knew each other, and his plan had just revealed a connection more dangerous than any previous hypothesis. Chapter 33. The third person reveals his face. Maigret returned to his headquarters, but he did not sit down immediately. He stood by the window, watching the rain fall on the street, his heart heavy. From the moment Renault and the man in the raincoat looked at each other, he knew that this was no longer a hunt for a single prey. This was a network, and this network could have surrounded him before he knew it. Lucas walked in, his coat still wet from the rain. "Sir, we have a witness, a drunk at the Café du Pont. Says he saw the raincoat man and Renault sitting at the same table a month ago." Maigret was not surprised. He just nodded slightly. "We will verify, but not through official records. At this rate, it is very possible that there are spies in this office." That night, Maigret went by himself to an abandoned apartment near the old market, where he knew he could hear footsteps coming from the alley behind. He left the lights off and sat in the dark. His pocket watch read 1 a.m. when the footsteps sounded. A figure approached, stopping just outside the alley. It wasn't Renault, nor the raincoat man. It was another man, a gaunt face, eyes darting from door to door. He took an envelope from his pocket, stuffed it into the door of a house opposite, and left. Maigret waited a few minutes, then crossed the street to pick up the envelope. Inside was a stack of photographs, all of Maigret. at various moments leaving the office, sitting in a bar, walking home. There were even shots from his bedroom window. A piece of paper was tucked between the photos, with only 4 words scrawled on it: "Don't hunt shadows." Chapter 34. Trap in the Dark. Maigret sat in his office all afternoon, but did not touch the pile of files in front of him. The photos in the envelope remained in the drawer, a living proof that this game was no longer a normal investigation. It had become a mutual stalking. Lucas entered, reporting that the raincoat man had not appeared in any of the taverns or streets he had frequented. Maigret merely nodded. "It's okay. He'll come to you." That night, he deliberately chose the darkest path home, walking slowly, like an old, exhausted prey. Occasionally, he would stop and light a cigarette, letting the smoke spread into small dots of light in the darkness, silent signal to anyone watching. On the 3rd corner, he heard footsteps, not hurried, not slow, just steady. A few yards away, Maigret kept walking, pretending not to notice. When he reached the narrow alley next to the abandoned warehouse, he turned abruptly. The street lights here had long since been broken, and there was only the smell of dampness and the sound of dripping water. Maigret took 3 more steps, then stopped. The footsteps behind him also stopped. The room was so quiet that Maigret could hear his own heartbeat. "Are you here to send me more photos?" Maigret said, his voice calm but loud enough. There was no answer, only the shadow of a figure emerging from the dark wall. The dim light from the alleyway illuminated his face, and Maigret realized that it was neither the man in the raincoat nor Renaud. He was a policeman. He was in the meeting with him last week. Chapter 35. The Wolf in the Pack. Maigret stood still. His eyes narrowed, not in surprise, but in confirmation of a suspicion that had been brewing in his mind for days. "What are you doing here?" Janvier, his voice was low, as if he only wanted the sound to reach the other person's ears. The young policeman smiled a little, but it was a stiff, unnatural smile. "It's just, I happen to be passing by. Paris is very small, sir." Maigret said nothing, just looked at Janvier's hand. His fingers trembled slightly, and in the darkness, a faint metal appeared, a lighter, the same kind as the one found beside the last victim. Paris is not so small, Maigret replied, taking a step forward. And I do not believe in coincidence that one of my policemen should appear just as a suspect is being lured out of a cave. Janvier swallowed, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape route. You don't understand. Things get out of hand. I just do a few things to balance things out. Balance. Maigret laughed softly, but without joy. Balance for whom? For the victim, or for those who paid you? The sound of someone's shoes coming from the alleyway startled Janvier. Maigret recognized Lucas, standing silently blocking the exit, his hands in his coat pockets. You will come with me, Janvier, said Maigret, or you will see if you can escape both me and Lucas in this darkness. Janvier gasped, his eyes flashing like a cornered animal. And then he pulled his hand from his pocket, not a lighter, but a compact pistol. Chapter 36. Gunshot in the night. The compact pistol loomed in Janvier's hand, its steel gleaming under the yellow streetlight. No one moved. Even breathing became heavy. Maigret stood still, his hands relaxed at his sides, but his eyes never left the barrel of the gun. He did not look at the weapon. He looked at the hand that held it tight, but still trembling slightly, as if its owner were not sure he would pull the trigger. You don't have to do that, Maigret said slowly, his voice even, no higher than the whisper of the wind. If you fire, it will all be over. There is no escape. Janvier chuckled, but it was a dry, lifeless laugh. No, sir. The end has come long ago. I am only closing the final door. Lucas shifted, his boots tapping lightly on the wet tiles, but the small noise still made Janvier turn around in surprise. For a moment, the barrel of the gun was gone from Maigret. That slight chance was enough for Maigret to take a step forward. But Janvier turned back faster. Don't, he shouted, his voice echoing against the narrow walls of the alley. A gunshot rang out. The sound was dry and crisp, and then the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. Maigret blinked, feeling a flash of heat across his left cheek. The bullet had passed, leaving a burning mark. He did not react instinctively. Instead, he lunged at Janvier, his heavy hands like steel tongs grabbing the traitor's wrist. The gun fell to the floor with a cold clang. Lucas immediately approached, clamped Janvier in his arms, and pressed him against the wall. Maigret breathed heavily, touching the thin line of blood on his cheek. You have chosen your own path, Janvier, he said, his voice as heavy as a sentence. And you know well where it leads. Janvier did not resist any more. His eyes were not filled with fear, but with exhaustion, like someone who had given up everything. From afar, the sound of police sirens began to echo, long and tearing through the quiet night of Paris. Chapter 37. Confession in the interrogation room. The interrogation room on the Quai des Orfèvres was lit by a single, dull ceiling light, which cast a yellowish-gray glow over an old, scratched wooden table. Outside, the Paris night was heavy with mist, but inside the room, the air was thick and hermetically sealed. Janvier sat opposite Maigret, his hands cuffed in front of him. He was still wearing his long dark coat, now rumpled with sweat and the acrid smell of gunpowder. He did not look directly at Maigret, but stared at the crack in the table, as if searching for a crack to escape from reality. Maigret lit a pipe, white smoke curling into thin rings that dissipated into the space between them. I know why I am here, he said, his voice low but clear. Janvier chuckled, not with joy, but with bitterness. I know, and I also know you won't believe a word I'm about to say. Try it. He raised his head, his eyes bloodshot, but strangely bright. It all started 2 years ago. A case you thought was closed, a man convicted, a file stamped done. But you left out one detail I can't forget. Maigret did not move, only inclined his head slightly. What details? Janvier took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly. The person you thought was the victim was not innocent at all. She controlled everything: money, lives, me. When I understood, it was too late. Everything I did after that was to cover up an initial mistake and to protect someone who did not deserve protection. Lucas, standing in the corner of the room, tightened his grip on his pen, but Maigret raised his hand to stop him. So the serial murders. Janvier nodded, his eyes downcast. Partly to shut you up, partly to send you a message." A long silence followed. Maigret exhaled, the smoke mingling with the metallic smell of handcuffs. He knew this was only the surface, and that what lay beneath would be far more dangerous. In the distance, church bells rang, signaling 3 a. Paris was still asleep. But in this room, a new match had just begun. Chapter 38. The Buried Truth. Maigret left the interrogation room and walked slowly down the long corridor, where the fluorescent lights cast cold patches of light on the gray tiles. Outside the window, the sky was already bright, but Paris was shrouded in a thick fog, as if trying to keep its own secrets. Lucas followed closely behind, his voice low. "Do you trust him?" Maigret paused, put his hand in his coat pocket, and his fingers touched the matchbox. "I don't believe it, but I don't ignore it either. What he said about the case 2 years ago." He paused, his eyes drifting to the dark end of the corridor. "Lucas, bring back the entire Laborde file from 1954 and the ancillary reports." The Laborde affair. The name stirred up a thick layer of dust in Lucas's memory. A murder on the riverbank. A woman's body bound by her hands. And a drunken sailor as the convict. The case was so simple, too simple. In his office, Maigret opened a filing cabinet. Stacks of yellowed papers stacked like layers of time. He flipped through the pages, his eyes settling on a black and white photograph. The victim lay on her side, her dark hair covering half her face. On her left wrist, a thin silver bracelet glimmered in the light of the lamp. Back then, it had been merely noted, but now, in Maigret's mind, it had become a sign. Lucas returned, placing a thick file on the table. "Do you think Janvier can—" "No," Maigret said slowly. "But he knows who did it. And that person is still out there." Outside the window, the fog was clearing, revealing the damp rooftops of Paris. Maigret lit his pipe and took a long drag. If he is telling the truth, we are entering a case where the dead man is not necessarily the victim, and the condemned man is not necessarily the perpetrator. Lucas was silent. No more words were needed. They both understood. They had just touched a vein in the city, where past and present were woven into a thread that was not easily untangled. Chapter 39. Survivor in the Darkness. That afternoon, Paris was raining. The cobblestone streets gleamed, reflecting the yellow lights from the bistros and cafes. Maigret sat in the car, his pipe long extinguished. Lucas was in the driver's seat, looking through the steamed-up windshield. "Are you sure this is the address?" Lucas asked. Maigret nodded, his eyes still fixed on a rotting wooden door at the end of the alley. The nameplate was rusted, the initials almost gone, only a few faint strokes remaining. The place had once been a small jewelry workshop, but records showed it had closed in 1955, the same year the Laborde case was closed. They knocked. The sound of slow, shuffling footsteps echoed from inside. The door opened slightly, revealing a thin, white-haired man whose eyes seemed accustomed to living in the dark. "Are you Etienne Morel?" Maigret asked. The man glanced quickly, then turned to close the door. But Maigret's hand held him still. "I'm here about Laborde." The silver bracelet. The name was like a knife, piercing through Morel's defenses. He stepped back, his eyes wavering. "I have nothing more to say." Maigret entered without waiting for an invitation. The only light in the small room came from a dusty table lamp. On the table, several old silver smithing tools lay untouched, as if abandoned in mid-use. "Who did you make that bracelet for?" Maigret asked in a low voice. Morel swallowed, then turned his gaze to the corner of the room. "Not for her, for a man. He wanted to give it to me as promised, but when the girl died, he forced me to be silent. He paid me enough to disappear." Lucas interjected his name. Morel was silent for a long time, then took a small box from the drawer and opened it. Inside was a miniature engraving of the bracelet, but on the inside, 3 letters were engraved, RDL. Maigret recognized it immediately. The initials belonged to a man who had escaped all charges in 1954. A man with power, money, and reason to want Laborde to be silenced forever. Outside, the rain was falling harder. Maigret folded the box and put it in his pocket. He knew that, from this moment on, the case had gone beyond what ordinary policemen could touch. Chapter 40. 3 letters and the price of truth. 4 o'clock in the morning. The Quai des Orfèvres headquarters was almost silent, save for the steady rain beating against the windows and the tapping of keyboards from the night watch room. Maigret sat alone in his office, Morel's small box on his desk. The desk lamp cast a dull yellow light on the 3 letters engraved inside the bracelet, RDL. He took a drag from his cigarette, let the smoke curl slowly in the air, and opened the old file. The name popped up immediately: Raoul de Lignac, businessman, owner of a chain of restaurants and nightclubs throughout Paris. The file read, "Insufficient evidence, released." But Maigret remembered clearly that in those days, witnesses disappeared overnight, and reports were withdrawn from the file without explanation. Lucas walked in, carrying a hot cup of coffee. "You know him?" Lucas asked, pointing to the file. Maigret nodded, his eyes never leaving the page. He was the kind of man who never got his hands dirty, but he was always there when things happen. Lucas put down his coffee and leaned over to look closely at the old photo of Raoul dark suit. Slight smile, eyes slightly squinted as if measuring the person in front of him. "What are you going to do?" Maigret did not answer immediately. He closed the file and placed his hand on the small box. "First, find someone alive to tell this story. Otherwise, we will be next on the silence list." An hour later, they were at a small bistro near the Gare de Lyon. A woman in her 60s with faded blonde hair was waiting in the corner. Her name was Jeanne, and she had been a singer at de Lignac's cabaret. When she saw the silver bracelet, her hands trembled. Raoul gave it to the girl, but not out of love, Jeanne said, her voice breaking. It was a warning. Whoever took it entered his game and never left. Outside, the rain had stopped, but in Maigret's heart, he knew that the air was only the calm before another storm, one that this time he would have to pay the price to enter.